Hello. After 1,091 days of all-out war in Ukraine,
ceasefire, just agreed to a little while ago.
On the first glance, it's amazing if we can get the Russians to agree to a ceasefire.
We hope that they'll say yes to peace. The ball's now in their court.
I'm pleased with where we've got to, but as ever, we must go further.
The question remains, once Russia agrees on paper, do they stick to the ceasefire?
I'll talk to Vladimir Putin, yeah, but it takes two to tango, as they say, right?
we have the first hope of even a pause in fighting. But if the 30-day ceasefire plan does happen, that's just the very first hurdle. The next is making it work on the battlefield.
The leaderships might agree, but the word has got to get right down to the most junior soldier in a slit trench, so that when they see people that surprise them, they haven't seen before, they don't start shooting at them.
General Lord Dannatt will share more insights from his time helping bring peace to Bosnia. We'll assess the big questions that still need answering, including what happens next if the ceasefire works and if it doesn't.
Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
Ukraine has done a trade, offering to enact an immediate 30-day ceasefire if Russia does the same. Immediate is a key word there, and in return the US has already ended its ban on intelligence sharing and military aid. Mike, what do you make of it all?
Well, two things immediately. One is that things are moving very quickly, as I think they tend to in diplomacy when they reach a certain point. Things move fast, and they move very fast when Trump is behind it, because as we've said before, it moves at Trump speed. And the second thing, I think, is that, again, as we've spoken before, it's a tactically sensible thing for the Ukrainians to keep agreeing to ceasefire, to outline ceasefires. However difficult and unrealistic they may be, they should keep agreeing to them in principle in order to call the Russians bluff or put the pressure on Russia to do the same. And 30 days may not mean very much or may not be easy to implement. But at this stage, it makes perfect sense for the Ukrainians to say, yes, we absolutely go along with this.
And once again, there are many moving parts and nothing is certain, but the best we can do is understand the possibilities. And with us once again to help explain what could happen next is Lord Peter Ricketts, former National Security Advisor, Ambassador to NATO and Chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee. Lord Ricketts, great to see you again. Thank you so much for joining us. It's Russia's move now, finally. I wonder if this makes it their turn to be on the back foot.
Yes, I think it does tactically. I think it's been very deftly handled by the Ukrainians with, I think, a lot of support from the UK. We've heard stories that the new UK National Security Advisor has been in Kyiv helping them, because I think the fundamental reason why Trump and Vance had that awful ambush with Zelensky in the Oval Office was somehow Trump understood that Zelensky didn't want peace. And he was an obstacle to a ceasefire, which was never true. I'm sure nobody wants peace more than the Ukrainians. He wants the right peace. And I think with this move, he has shown Trump that he does want peace. And as you say, the ball is now back in the Russian court. They will not say no outright to the Americans. I'm sure they're too clever for that. Equally, I don't think they can say yes. So I guess they will try and say yes, but. And they will add conditions like no European forces on the soil of Ukraine, and no doubt others. And they will try and have conditions which mean it then becomes impossible for Zelensky to accept. And we will then be in some sort of horse trade with the Americans in the middle, playing the intermediary role. And that gives me cause for worry.
And Peter, Washington has reportedly warned Moscow it will simply arm Ukraine to the teeth if it doesn't agree to a ceasefire, though. Is that enough to ensure Russia does agree to pause fighting?
Well, it's certainly not what Putin wanted to hear. I think he probably hoped that he'd got Trump in his pocket and it would be fairly straightforward. It's clearly not going to be that straightforward. But I don't underestimate that guy's manipulative ability, Putin. He's an old spy with a lot of experience. And I just fear that when they are sitting at the table with the Americans, they will somehow introduce some points which then become very difficult for the Ukrainians. So we are in the early stages of this. I think the idea of a very quick ceasefire may turn out to be difficult because it's absolutely not in Russian interests. I think they're also trying to push the remaining Ukrainian forces out of the Kursk salient so that there's no Ukrainian hanging on to Russian territory. We will see. I have a feeling this is going to prove a longer business even to get to a 30-day ceasefire than Trump would like.
And we've talked quite a few times before, Mike, about the risk of this becoming a frozen conflict. Ukraine must surely have factored into its decision that a 30-day ceasefire could eventually lead to a current front line becoming a new de facto border. Mike, how much of their land would that mean they'd have lost?
Just coming up to 20%. People use 20% as the sort of ballpark figure. It's actually about 18% and a little bit. In territorial terms, but it's very much in Ukraine's interest. I mean, and they've talked, over the last 6 or 8 months about the understanding that they won't recover this territory in the short term, but they won't give up legal right to it, nor should they, because this is their territory as laid down in 1991 as one of the successor states to the old Soviet Union, as indeed is Russia, which has no more legitimacy than Ukraine in that respect. But what they really want out of this, I think, is a sense that the other 80% of Ukraine will be secure and can get on with being a developed, modern European state. And then they can get back to addressing the 20% in a couple of generations' time. I think that's what's in their minds. And that's, in a way, at the moment, is probably their best option.
And Mike, how much of that 20% was effectively in Russian hands before the 2022 invasion?
About half of it. So in general, or a bit less than half, I mean, about 7 or 8%. I mean, before the 2022 invasion, they held Crimea and they held about a third of Donetsk and Luhansk. And what they've done is they've taken now 2/3 of Donetsk and Luhansk. They've taken about 2/3 or between a half and 2/3 of Zaporizhia. And they had taken most of Kherson, but they've been thrown out of about half of it. So they've got about half of Kherson and they still hold all of Crimea. So in a way, they've more than doubled the territory that they had before this incursion, this latest invasion. But it still leaves them with something just under 20% of total Ukrainian territory, which is the more industrialized part. It's the old coal mining, manufacturing centers. That area used to manufacture a lot of weapons for the old Soviet Union. In a way, it's the more valuable part. The rest of Ukraine is more rural. It's based on agriculture much more. So this is the part that they would most have wanted, I suppose, in a purely geopolitical sense.
And Peter, if a ceasefire agreement is reached, how much detail would you expect there to be of any such agreement about what forces on each side can and can't do in that time?
Well, I think the implications of what Trump is talking about an immediate ceasefire for 30 days is there'd be almost no detail. It would simply be a standstill where forces were. I don't know that there'll be any proposals for observation internationally of what's going on. So it's a kind of quick and dirty stop to the fighting, I think, is what Trump is talking about, with then all those much more difficult details to be discussed in a phase 2. I mean, a little bit like we've seen in Gaza, where there was a phase 1, there were some conditions attached. But I think probably everything will be kicked down to the end of a 30-day period and use that period to try and get some initial dialogue going, some initial confidence building, so that in phase 2 you could move on to other things like prisoner exchange and begin to talk about sanctions lift and so on. But no, I don't. I think the way Trump is looking at it, there would be minimum and there would be no security guarantee in there for Ukraine. That's the gamble that Ukraine is having to take.
So no security guarantee at the moment, you say, for Ukraine. Mike, I'm guessing that for now it would be self-police, though, on the ground then, and any talk of British troops or a coalition of the willing is for much later.
It may be, yes. I mean, I think what the Europeans are trying to do, the British and French initiative in particular, is at least to do some preliminary planning to indicate to the Americans that if we get to the point where this becomes a practicality, we are ready to play some sort of part. And I'm sure what we're trying to say to the Americans is, look, we can be part of it, but get your own military professionals to look at this. It won't work unless you are backing it up. And your own professionals will tell you that. So in a way, rather than be passive and wait for things to happen around us, the Europeans are trying to say, look, we don't know where this is going. This is a step-by-step approach. But insofar as we can be ready, here is the sort of thing we can do. When you look at it, you will see, we think, that you have to back this up in some way. I think that's the game that Britain and France are really playing in this respect.
Well, let's get some more thoughts on the military practicalities of a ceasefire from the former head of the Army, General Lord Dannatt. Lord Dannatt, great to see you on Sitrep again. Thank you very much for joining us. You've been a key neutral party to some significant agreements to end hostilities over the years, haven't you? Can you just talk us through some of them?
Well, I suppose the key one, which is about the closest analogy one can draw, is the ceasefire in Bosnia in autumn 1995 that eventually led in December 1995 to the Dayton Peace Agreement. Now, as awful as the Bosnian Civil War was, of course, it was not at a level of intensity such as we have seen and are seeing still between Russia and Ukraine in Ukraine. But it did mean that British forces there, under the United Nations banner during the ceasefire period, had to monitor the ceasefire to make sure that it held, and that it held long enough for the warring parties at very senior level to get together around a table, which was actually in Dayton, Ohio, in the United States, to hammer out the headlines of a peace agreement that became the Dayton Peace Agreement. Now, 30 years on, most people would probably agree that the ceasefire, or the Dayton Agreement, should I say, was a pretty reasonable ceasefire deal, but it was a terrible formula for a lasting peace, which is why Bosnia is still the poorest country in Europe, still divided into two entities, Serb on one side and Croat and Muslim on the other side, and has condemned that country to 30 years of very poor growth and very limited prospects. Now, that's the nearest analogy I can come to, and I was there during all that time. But what's going to happen over the next few days, the next few weeks in Ukraine, well, remains to be seen. We know that the Americans and the Ukrainians have put their heads together and agreed a blueprint for a 30-day ceasefire, possibly extendable. But what we don't know yet is whether the Russians are going to agree to this and what conditions they might impose.
And of course, a ceasefire is the very first step, often associated with the word fragile. What is the reality of a ceasefire for commanders and their troops on the ground?
Well, again, one of the problems of a ceasefire, and you're quite right to call it fragile, is the leaderships might agree, but the word has got to get right down to the most junior soldier in a slit trench. And again, I can remember going back to Bosnia, the need for us to impress on the leadership of all three warring factions that if this ceasefire is going to work and the peace agreement is going to work, they've got to get the word right down to the most junior soldier so that when they see people that surprise them, they haven't seen before, they don't start shooting at them. And I knew that has succeeded on one occasion when, in fact, we were very concerned about crossing over into the Serb-held area, and we found the Serb soldiers in their best uniforms. So clearly the message had got to them that we were coming to bring peace and not to bring war. But my overall point is, given the high level of casualties between Russians and Ukrainians over the last 3 years, the temptation for a Ukrainian soldier or a Russian soldier to take a pot shot at the other side and therefore to risk disrupting the ceasefire is extraordinarily high, given the huge level of casualties we've seen.
And just how hard is it for them to manage all of that, for that to be managed?
Well, I think it would be extraordinarily hard. Now, I don't know what mechanisms are being thought about. I think by most people's observation, the impracticality of trying to interpose an intervention force of neutral troops between the Russians and the Ukrainians is frankly practically impossible. The 1,000-kilometre or so front line would absorb a huge number of troops. I think if there's going to be any monitoring of a ceasefire, it's more likely to have to be done with satellite surveillance, aerial surveillance, drone-type surveillance, just so that there is a safer way of seeing what is going on. But of course, seeing what is going on doesn't necessarily mean that you can do anything about it. So it comes back to my original point, is that if the leaderships decide that there's going to be a ceasefire, word has got to get right down to the front lines, right down to the soldiers on both sides in the slit trenches.
And you mentioned there the risk, the temptation to want to exact revenge. Anyone there, from the most senior to the most junior, might face what they feel is a definitive breach of the ceasefire from the other side and then have to decide how they respond or not.
Yes, I mean, that is all part of managing a ceasefire. And I think it really must flow from the strategic level, the degree of determination on the Ukrainian side or on the Russian side that they've decided that for the time being at least, cease shooting at each other, cease fighting is preferable to continuing. But Kate, I think if we're absolutely honest about it, while there might be a chance of getting a ceasefire nominally for 30 days, and it may not hold for 30 days, what is the basis for a lasting peace beyond that? And it's very hard to see that. Unless President Zelensky is going to give up on his determination to regain control of the 20% of Ukraine that's been lost to the Russians, and all the Russians are being willing to withdraw, then frankly their negotiating positions remain as irreconcilable today as they were 3 years ago.
Yeah, I appreciate that we're talking theoretically, but there will be no peace agreement without any ceasefire first, and each situation will be unique. What details do you think Ukrainian commanders might be hoping to have included if there is any ceasefire agreement?
Well, I suppose ideally the best way to ensure a ceasefire is a withdrawal from frontline positions to agree some form of geographic separation between the two sides. I think that is more likely to prevent an accidental breaking of the ceasefire. But there again, you see, you've got practical issues there. The soldiers on both sides, very close to each other, chin to chin, toe to toe at the present moment, are in their prepared frontline positions. So who's going to be willing to give up those prepared positions and pull back a kilometre or two to unprepared positions? Because, once you've left your defensive position and the other side acts in bad faith, you could suddenly find yourself being rolled over. So again, these are sort of practical considerations that are very hard to manage. Going back to Bosnia again, one of the things that we had to do during the NATO implementation was to take the heavy weapons off both sides, get the troops back into barracks, get them away from the front line. But as difficult as that war was, it was manageable and it was done. And areas of territory were handed over from one side to another as required by the peace agreement. But I just can't see, after the intensity of this war over the last 3 years, that being a realistic possibility. I think the only potential formula for some form of lasting peace of any length of time is for the Ukrainians very reluctantly to accept they're not going to get their 20% back in eastern Ukraine, and for the Russians to say, well, at least for the time being, that's as far as we're going. But this, of course, brings the whole wider issue about the security of Europe more generally. Can we trust the Russians? Frankly, no, we can't. Can we trust them not to attack again in Ukraine? Can we trust them in a few years' time, when they reconstituted their military, not to press against Poland, not to press against the Baltic states, not to press anywhere else? Frankly, you can't trust Putin and his Russians at all. And the way that Putin has spun this story to his people, they now genuinely believe that the West caused this war, that they're fighting an existential fight for their own beloved Russia. So anything is possible because they have been fed such propaganda, lies and rubbish by the Putin regime.
And taking into account everything that you have said, what are your thoughts and feelings then on the possibility of a ceasefire in Ukraine? Is it worth trying at this point?
I think it's worth trying, if only to have a cessation of fighting and a pause in the horrific level of casualties. But it's really a question of then what people then do with that ceasefire. I think the Russians will undoubtedly use the opportunity to reconstitute themselves, and they will probably think the Ukrainians will do exactly the same. And if one heard earlier in the week the former Deputy Defense Minister of Ukraine speaking in the media, he was saying that the best way of guaranteeing the ceasefire is for the West to continue to equip, arm and reinforce the Ukrainians. Well, that's what he wants. That's what the Russians will do as well. Why? Because they don't trust each other. And therefore the realistic possibility of a resumption of the fighting, regretfully one has to say, is rather high. In fact, very high.
Lord Dannatt, always good to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Kate.
Mike, what would you expect to see troops on both sides doing in any ceasefire? Stay in place and dig in?
Yes, I mean, I think Lord Dannatt was exactly right about that. And I mean, nobody's going to withdraw a few kilometres unless they're sure the other side has done the same. And it may be possible to engineer that. But if there were a sort of demilitarised zone of, let's say, 5 kilometres either side of the line of contact as it now exists, both sides would spend a lot of time trying to, infiltrate into that area, keep a good eye on it, and so on. So I think whether they do it in exactly the position they're in now or in position just behind where they are now, they will dig in. I'm certain about that. They will not withdraw from their more or less the line of contact that they are presently in.
And Mike, you'd imagine both sides would take the opportunity to rearm and reinforce. In 30 days, does either side have more to gain from that chance?
At the moment, Ukraine has more to gain from that because they need the break more than the Russians do. The Russians are rolling forward very, very slowly, I have to say, apart from what's happening in Kursk. And it looks as if they will take the Kursk pocket, the salient, back before any meaningful negotiations really get moving. And that will have been a strategic failure for the Ukrainians. They've got something out of the Kursk operation, but not as much as they will have hoped, I'm sure. But down in the south, the Russians are still, they've surrounded Pokrovsk, but they haven't taken it. They've surrounded Chasiv Yar, but they haven't taken it. They took Toretsk, but now they've lost some of it. And because they've taken some of their good units from the south to go to the north to actually snuff out the Kursk salient, they're moving very slowly in the south. So I don't expect the Russians don't need this ceasefire as much as the Ukrainians, because the Russians think they're doing well, but they're not doing as well as they say they are. But the immediate relief will come to Ukraine, who really do need some sort of pause, if only to reorganise themselves and look at the stocks they've got and what they can build up in the short term over the next 3 or 4 months.
Peter, you mentioned him earlier, Jonathan Powell, who has your old job, National Security Advisor. He's been hands-on involved in drawing up this ceasefire plan, working directly with President Zelensky, among others. If that had been you, what would have been your priorities in terms of any ceasefire deal from a UK perspective?
Well, I think, first of all, they did absolutely right, handling the Americans to not jump onto social media and condemn what Trump did in the Oval Office, to work quietly behind the scenes, to bring the Europeans together, as they did in that London meeting last Sunday, and to work out a practical plan. And phase one had to be to bring the Americans to accept that the Ukrainians are interested in peace, and therefore to make this proposal of a 30-day ceasefire, putting them on the front foot, putting the ball back in the Russian court. Now, I think that the British side need to be thinking about the next stages. I think everything that Richard Dannat was saying is very interesting. The Bosnia precedent is not really a precedent, because there were massive NATO forces against a relatively weak adversary in Serbia, and the Russians standing on the sidelines. So this is very different. I think the one area where I have real concerns is this talk about a reassurance force. I can understand why the Europeans, British and the French, want to have proposals to put on the table to say to the Americans, we're serious about helping here. But unless there is a very clear American commitment to come to the aid of a force deployed in Ukraine, the so-called backstop, then it's going to be very dangerous, I think, because you would effectively be putting forces into a situation where the Russians would declare they're hostile, that they're legitimate targets, and then there would be a game of bluff and counter-bluff as to whether the Russians would somehow either attack the force or undermine it with sort of hybrid warfare type activity. And you could very quickly find that a European force was in direct confrontation with Russian forces. So I would be very wary of talking about that unless we've got an absolutely cast-iron guarantee from the Americans that they'd be there if the force got into trouble. And I frankly don't see Trump providing that kind of assurance, because everything about Trump is, I pull back from wars, I get out of wars, I bring peace. And I don't think he would give that. So I'm pretty skeptical, and I think Richard Dannat was sounding quite skeptical as well, as to whether this European force will actually see the light, although, as I say, I understand why it's being discussed. But much more likely, I guess, would be some sort of UN-backed light observation mission to try to put some international eyes on how the ceasefire was being implemented. There again, there'll be many risks, but having a completely unobserved ceasefire, depending just on the goodwill of the two sides in a time when there's deep, deep hostility between them, that really is a recipe for that word fragile that you were using, a very fragile and probably very short-lived ceasefire.
And of course, we're not even at the point of a ceasefire yet. But in case we do get there, we need to be prepared for what might follow. And there's two basic options. Let's start with the less optimistic one, Mike. If it breaks down, is it just a return to exactly the same fighting?
Probably, yes. I mean, both sides have got their strategic positions. So the Russians want to take more territory. The Ukrainians want to keep the Black Sea open for their trade. They both have now crossed the line of, long since crossed the line of attacking each other's territory directly with aerial warfare, with drones and missiles. So it's difficult to see which side would do something different as and when a fragile ceasefire breaks down.
And diplomatically, Peter, would that be the end of Donald Trump's peace push?
Well, it's so hard to predict Donald Trump, isn't it? I think there's a risk that if he tries and he is defied by both sides or by one side, he might throw his hand in and say, well, forget it. I've got higher priorities than to waste my time here. I think for the Ukrainians, the critical thing is they need to come out of this with the Russians clearly the ones defying a ceasefire and refusing to accept one. Because what they really do need to try to maintain, if at all possible, is American intelligence support, continued American weapons supplies, even if at a reduced level. That's their best guarantee of survival in this, because the Europeans are now, I think, increasingly moving to upping defense production, increasing the money going into the armaments industries. But all that is going to take time before there's any increase in what the Europeans can supply to Ukraine. And to fill that gap, they really do need the Americans. So I think that the Ukrainian tactic will be go on saying yes to proposals put forward by Trump in the hope that if this breaks down, it breaks down because the Russians have been obdurate, and that Trump comes out of this, as he's started to say in recent days, prepared to think about rearming Ukraine massively, slapping sanctions on Russia. None of that is at all certain, but that is the best outcome for Ukraine if the ceasefire breaks down.
Mike, could we even see one side trying to win diplomatically by goading the other into restarting the fighting and being the guilty party, as it were?
Oh, for sure. I mean, when these fragile ceasefires are arrived at in many situations, one side tries to undermine it by goading the other side into some sort of attack. And I think there'll be a lot of that going on, which is why, as Lord Peter said, we might think in terms of some sort of UN-mandated observation force, and certainly some sort of independent body who would very quickly have a look at the circumstances and pronounce upon what is happening within 24 or 48 hours. The worst thing in all of these situations is that an incident which may be provoked as an agent provocateur operation, then escalates. And by the end of 4 or 5 days of fighting, everybody's forgotten what started it. They're just aware of a level of fighting after 4 or 5 days. So it's very important to try to create some sort of mechanism to nip anything in the bud. But these sort of incidents would happen on probably a daily basis in any ceasefire that we're talking about.
Peter, you're nodding at all of this.
Yeah, no, I think Mike is right. I think that's all too likely. The Russians are past masters at this kind of manipulative, subversive activity, semi-deniable events, attacks that happen in the night, and they never quite claim responsibility. And there must be a great risk of that. In thinking about what kind of international presence might be conceivable, the only solution I can come up with in this atmosphere of hostility between the two sides is some sort of UN force or observation mission, perhaps made up of countries where Russians really wouldn't want to kill soldiers from those countries. So, for example, India. India has a fine record of participation in international peacekeeping. The Russians certainly wouldn't want to find that they had killed Indian forces. That's the sort of thing which you might imagine would put a few international eyes and ears on the ground. Dangerous work. I mean, UNIFIL in Lebanon did that for many years as well. That's the kind of thing which might give a little bit of hope that we can avoid, a slither back down the slope to outright fighting. And the only other thing the West can do, as we've been saying, I think, is to keep rearming Ukraine and hope that if this Trump opportunity for a pause in the fighting fails, then Putin begins to see that he is never going to completely win this war, especially if the Americans are still supporting the Ukrainians, that the cost to Russia is growing, the weakness of the Russian economy is becoming a real factor, and he has to begin to recalculate what he can achieve. This is hurting Russia. It's not so apparent from the outside, perhaps, as much as it's hurting Ukraine, but there could be, I suppose, a reconsideration if it's clear that Putin isn't going to be able to manipulate Trump into a Russia-friendly ceasefire of the thing he thought he must have hoped for at one point.
And Mike, Lord Dannatt spoke about technology for observation and policing. Is that realistic to do it all from the sky and from space?
Well, it's a lot more realistic now than it would have been even 10 years ago. So the improvements, certainly in drone technology, the ability of drones to spend a long time over a given area, plus satellite technologies, plus sensors on the ground and remote sensors. Yes, I mean, at a price, you could monitor even, 1,200 kilometers of contact line at a price, and you don't have to have people there. But ultimately, if something is going to be enforced, as Lord Peter says, I mean, any force has got any enforcement group, any enforcement group of forces has got to be prepared to fight a peer power. Russians or even Ukrainians. I mean, we're not talking here about being prepared for a bit of muscular peacekeeping. Any group that is enforcing this line of no contact, this demilitarized zone, whatever it might be, has got to be prepared to open fire on a peer country's forces, whichever side it is. And I don't know that there are many countries who would opt to do that.
Let's look at the more optimistic route now then. A ceasefire holds for 30 days. What are the next steps to peace, Peter?
Well, I think you then want to do a series of steps, for example, prisoner exchanges. For example, beginning to talk about, are there any sanctions that could progressively be lifted? Getting that minerals deal done in Ukraine so that there would be an American mining operation, perhaps protected by private security companies, which puts at least some American assets on the ground. Those sorts of issues, perhaps then negotiating a move further back from a contact line, creating a buffer zone, which would make a ceasefire more stable, and some sort of more permanent international observation mechanism, perhaps reporting to the Security Council about implementation of the ceasefire. I think those are the sorts of things that could move a very fragile tactical ceasefire into something you could begin to call a more durable settlement. Of course, it wouldn't solve the final status issues of the final status of the Russian occupied territories. But then with the divided Germany, we waited 40 years to unify Germany. In Korea, the demilitarized zone is still there 80 years on, pretty much from the end of 70 years on from the end of the fighting in Korea. So these things can become permanent. Of course, in the case of Korea, with a very large American contingent still in the country. But those are the sort of things that would turn something very fragile potentially into something that was a bit more durable.
And Mike, do you think Ukraine could be demanding security guarantees in place, possibly British boots on the ground, within weeks to firm up a path to peace?
Well, I'm sure the Ukrainians will keep talking about this because they have to. It's the only thing that makes longer term sense for them. They'll keep saying we must have security guarantees. And I would say that if I was in Kyiv as well. The issue is that we're not quite in that territory at the moment diplomatically. So, yes, they'll keep demanding it. The British, I think, with the French, will stay in the forefront of trying to think through alternatives. But I go back to what we said before. You can lay out as many alternatives as you like. And I've been involved in discussions in the last couple of weeks where we've been through as many as we can think of, and none of them work without American backup. None of them. And that comes from American very senior generals as well as European and British senior generals and intelligence chiefs. Nothing works without American backup.
Yeah.
So before we get some final thoughts from you both, I just want to look at the bigger picture and a more self-interested picture it is. Whatever the outcome of this, it doesn't change a single punctuation mark on the need for Britain, the rest of Europe and NATO to step up militarily, does it, Peter?
It absolutely doesn't. It just reinforces the case for that. And I think one of the effects of the recent Trump upheaval in this area has been to turbocharge UK-European relations, not just UK-EU, but with wider European countries. We've seen Keir Starmer very effectively pull European countries together for that summit last Sunday. We've seen a collective realization across Europe that every country needs to be spending significantly more on defense in a more dangerous world. We've got the arrival of German Chancellor Friedrich Merz shortly with a very defense-oriented agenda, intention to raise 100 billion euros or 150 billion euros of new spending for German armed forces. We've got Starmer and Macron working well. I think with Merz, they would make a trio who could really push Europe forward. So, yeah, there's been a real wake-up call. You could say too late. It's been too slow, and it will take time to come through into real military capability. But that is a real change, I think, reflecting the fact that whatever happens in Ukraine, we have to expect the Americans are going to reduce their presence, military presence in Europe, their commitment to European security, even if they still stay committed nominally to NATO. And in that circumstance, we've got to make a reality of what people have long talked about, of more European capacity to stand on our own feet in terms of our own security and defence.
And Mike, as we speak, the Defence Secretary is meeting counterparts again in Paris to discuss all of this. Are we going to see actions that actually match the words?
That's the intention. And I think, what we've seen in this government, and I think what we'll probably see in the defence review and the defence reform process, is a sea change in government and maybe public expectations of what we in Britain have to do about defence. I mean, I've never detected this sort of sea change before in the time I've been looking at British defence policy. Whether it'll come to as much as the government thinks it should, we will see. But I promise you that underlying so many of the announcements which have been made and which will be made in the middle and later part of this year is an attempt to reorientate our thinking about the first duty of government, which is to manage and guarantee the security of its citizens.
And what about the action from the rest of non-US NATO?
Oh, that's very important. And I think what we're seeing is NATO moving into a sort of a north-south division. It's not really a split, but I've never known a time when the agenda of the northern countries, the Scandinavians, the Baltic states, Denmark, Netherlands, Great Britain, and France is more of a northern NATO country than a southern NATO country. Their agenda is more different than ever before to the security agendas of countries like Spain and Italy and the southeast European states. They're more concerned about fragmentation, about what happens in the Middle East, about immigration and so on. And I think what we're seeing is a NATO of 32, which will become almost like a two-tier NATO with a northern group who are more like the traditional NATO that we remember from the 1960s, and a southern group who have a slightly more generalized view of it. And we've got to put Canada, I think, into that northern group, maybe increasingly so in view of latest developments.
Well, before events overtook us, we had planned a whole conversation today about the state of NATO deterrence and the questions about US commitment to help defenders. One idea that's had some mention in the last couple of weeks is that a European nation like Britain might take on NATO's top military command post, SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander Europe. And so we have an extra edition of the Sitrep podcast online now with former SACEUR General Philip Breedlove. He explains what the job involves, the influence it has, and what he thinks of that idea.
As a military leader, and when I was a SACEUR multiple times in reaction to Russia's first invasion of Crimea and then second their invasion of the Donbass, I had to go to the NAC and present options for the NAC to consider as responses. But once again, the North Atlantic Council, the NAC, is the real power in NATO.
And he also goes on to share a fascinating story about that time, explaining how he was barred from taking action as a NATO commander, but then managed to make it happen anyway because he was also a US commander. That's online now, wherever you get your podcasts. Let's get some final thoughts now. Peter, how optimistic are you about the possibilities right now for Ukraine's future and its consequences for the rest of us?
Well, it's hard to be optimistic that this war is going to end anytime soon, or in a way which leaves Ukraine in a place to grow into a confident, independent, Western-oriented democracy that will strengthen all our security. That's what I would like to see. That's what should happen. That's what the Ukrainians have earned by their courage and their tenacity over the last 3 years. And perhaps in the long term, that's where we'll get, because I think the damage to Russia has been much greater than is apparent at the moment. But we are still a long way away from that. And the unpredictability of the Trump administration and the blowing hot and cold on whether Ukraine is the obstacle, where Zelensky should be removed, which was the kind of rhetoric a week ago in Washington, to where we are now, where the Americans seem to be now putting the extra pressure on Russia. That makes me nervous about getting to that kind of solution that we want to see. However, I think as Europeans, we have no alternative but to go on working for that. And whatever happens over the next few weeks and wherever American support goes, British interest is clearly to keep doing all we can to ensure that Ukraine comes out of this with a path to being a free and independent country, one day a member of NATO. It can feel a long way away at the moment, but that's where British interests lie, and that's what we should continue to do.
For Ukraine's future, I think it's damage limitation. We've got to play for the long term, which is one of the things that the Western world has been quite good at in general. But the wider consequences of this, I mean, whether or not we think that President Trump is a spike in a long-term trend or something quite eccentric is a different sort of issue. But what President Trump has given us just in the last couple of months is a historic geopolitical reorientation, which goes back to 1917. I mean, in 1917, the United States came into the First World War at a time when the Bolshevik Revolution created a new sort of Russia, Soviet Union, or what became the Soviet Union. And that orientation has remained fairly consistent, notwithstanding the Second World War, from 1917 onwards. That geopolitical reorientation has now taken place very, very quickly. And with that, I would argue, is a moral reorientation. The United States doesn't seem interested now in being the leader of a democratic world. And that is very, very uncomfortable for the Europeans. So we've got to get through that, and we've got to play for the long term.
Mike, Lord Peter Ricketts, thank you both. We'll have another Sitrep for you next Thursday. Whatever else happens between now and then, you can stay right up to date on our website, forcesnews.com. From me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for joining us. Bye for now.